Clara was calmly driving down the deserted road, heading home after a long and exhausting day at work. The fatigue weighed heavily on her shoulders, but despite this, she felt satisfied with her recent career achievements. The car radio played soft music, which helped ease some of the accumulated stress. The night was peaceful, with no traffic or major commotion, and the calmness of the journey was almost relaxing. Suddenly, up ahead, the red and blue lights of a police checkpoint began flashing, breaking the serenity of the moment. Clara didn't think much of it, slowed down, and pulled the car to the side of the road, as she would in any similar situation. It must be a routine inspection, she thought, trying to stay calm. However, she soon felt a tension in the air, something that made her slightly uncomfortable. As she waited, she noticed the officers' gazes, which seemed to evaluate her more critically than usual. One of them, a tall man with a stern expression, walked toward her. His steps were firm, and his rigid posture made it clear he wasn't there for a simple check. "Good evening, ma'am. Your documents, please," he asked in a firm voice, showing no cordiality. Clara handed over her documents, trying to stay calm, though the atmosphere was already starting to weigh on her. The officer took the papers and quickly examined them. After a few seconds of silence, he asked her to step out of the car. "Why do I need to get out of the car? What's the problem?" Clara asked politely, trying to understand the reason for the stop. "Suspicious behavior," he responded dryly, without offering further explanation. Surprised and bothered, Clara complied and stepped out of the car. She felt the eyes of the other officers, who were slowly approaching. Something about the way they looked at her didn't seem right. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible aggression, but Clara recognized that kind of behavior. Keeping calm, she stood by the car, watching as the officers began to search her belongings. They gave no explanation, and Clara knew that at that moment, her best option was to wait and not react. The injustice of the situation was obvious, but she decided to remain silent. She knew that sooner or later, the truth would come to light, and the officers would realize the grave mistake they were making. Clara stood beside her car, arms crossed, her expression calm, but inside her mind raced with questions. Minutes dragged on as the officers searched every inch of her vehicle. They rummaged through her bags, the glove compartment, and under the seats, all without offering any explanation. The tension in the air was almost tangible, and Clara knew the situation was becoming more complicated than it should be. As one officer continued to search her belongings, another, younger and visibly arrogant, approached her with a cynical smile. His eyes gleamed with a mixture of distrust and disdain. "What were you doing here at this hour?" he asked, his voice dripping with insinuation. "This area isn't exactly known for being safe. We have reasons to believe you're hiding something." Clara took a deep breath. Frustration was starting to build inside her, but she knew that any overreaction could make things worse. Keeping her tone controlled, she replied, "I'm on my way home after a day of work. I don't see any reason for suspicion." The younger officer didn't seem to care about her response. He continued to stare at her, as if waiting for her to make a mistake, any slip-up that could justify a more aggressive action. Around them, the other officers watched the scene, their expressions ranging from curiosity to judgment. No one seemed interested in resolving the situation fairly. The situation was already uncomfortable, but what happened next only made it worse. While rummaging through one of Clara's bags, the older officer found an item that caught his attention. He lifted it up, turning to her with a serious, almost confused expression. "Can you explain what this is?" he asked, holding up the object for everyone to see. Clara looked at the officer, and at that moment, she realized that he still had no idea who she really was. He hadn't recognized her name on the documents, nor had he grasped the seriousness of what he was doing. With a slight smile, Clara calmly responded, "You'll find out soon enough." Her answer was cryptic, But she chose not to give any further explanations. She knew the moment of truth was near, and soon the officers would realize the grave mistake they were making. The officer, now even more unsettled by her composure, tried to maintain control of the situation, but the discomfort in his eyes was clear. Meanwhile, Clara remained silent, watching as the situation unfolded. She knew that her patience would soon pay off. The tension in the air seemed to spread like smoke. Still standing by her car, Clara calmly observed the officers, who were now visibly more uneasy. The younger officer, who continued to stand beside her, kept asking persistent questions, as if trying to extract a non-existent confession. "Don't you think it's suspicious, ma'am? A woman alone driving through this area at this time of night?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Clara, keeping control of her emotions, replied coldly, "I'm just coming back from work, as I already said. It's my usual route." The young officer rolled his eyes, clearly dissatisfied with her answer. He seemed determined to find some reason to justify the excessive stop. The discomfort was increasing, but Clara knew it wasn't the time to act or reveal her true identity. Meanwhile, the older officer continued to inspect the object he had found in her bag, furrowing his brow with an expression of doubt. He was trying to understand what it was and why Clara was carrying it. His unease only made it clear that they were approaching a critical point in the situation. As this was happening, more officers began to gather around the car. The group, which had previously stood at a distance observing with curiosity, now seemed interested in knowing what was going on. The heavy stares, filled with judgment, were hard to ignore, but Clara stood her ground. She knew that giving in to pressure at that moment wouldn't help her at all. Suddenly, one of the officers made a subtly racist joke, provoking muffled laughter among some of the others. Clara felt a wave of indignation wash over her, but she remained impassive. She understood that any exaggerated reaction could turn an already tense situation into something even more serious. The silence, as difficult as it was to maintain, would be her best response for now. The younger officer, clearly unsatisfied with Clara's lack of immediate reaction, stepped closer, invading her personal space. His voice was now lower, almost a whisper, but laced with venom. "Do you think you're above us?" he asked. "I think you still don't understand the gravity of the situation." Clara briefly locked eyes with the officer. She knew he was trying to intimidate her, provoke a reaction. But she had learned throughout her life that self-control was the most powerful weapon in moments like this. "I understand exactly what's happening here," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I'm just waiting for you all to understand too." Her calm and confident response seemed to disarm the officer for a moment. He stepped back, confused, as if he didn't know how to continue the interrogation. Around them, the other officers began to murmur among themselves, and Clara sensed that the atmosphere of distrust was reaching its limit. She knew the moment to reveal her true identity was approaching. Deep down, Clara could already picture the shock spreading across the faces of every officer present. But for now, she preferred to let the situation run its natural course, allowing them to realize the mistake they were making. The next few minutes would be crucial. The tension was at its peak. Clara remained impassive, even as the officers' gazes grew more severe. The younger officer, who had seemed determined to intimidate her, was now visibly unsettled. Clara's confidence was throwing him off balance, causing him to question the approach he had taken. Meanwhile, the older officer, still holding the mysterious object he had taken from Clara's bag, decided to make one last attempt. He approached slowly, as if weighing his words carefully. "Ma'am, why are you carrying this?" he asked, raising the object once again for her to see clearly. Clara looked at the object in his hands, a small golden badge. She knew this was the pivotal moment of the night. Without losing her calm, she responded with the same serenity she had maintained from the beginning. It's a badge of honor, one that represents my commitment to justice and integrity, she stated, her voice steady. I work as an attorney for a civil rights organization. I advocate for those who have faced discrimination and injustice. I'm here tonight not because I'm doing something wrong, but because I'm dedicated to making a difference. This is my badge, she said slowly. I'm a district attorney. The impact of her words was immediate. Silence enveloped the group of officers, as if a wave of shock had passed through them all at once. The older officer looked at the badge in his hands as if he were seeing it for the first time. The severe expression on his face began to fade, giving way to surprise and embarrassment. The younger officer, who had once displayed boundless arrogance, now seemed frozen, his face changing rapidly from the red of anger to the white of shame. He took a step back, trying to process what he had just heard. "You're a district attorney?" he stammered, his voice suddenly low and stripped of its previous aggression.
Clara simply nodded, not needing to say anything more. The mere fact of who she was already explained the gravity of the situation. She knew the game had changed, and now it was their turn to recognize the significant mistake they had made in treating her that way. A murmur began among the other officers, who now avoided making direct eye contact with Clara. The atmosphere, once laden with distrust and hostility, transformed into a mix of embarrassment and regret. The young officer, who had previously questioned her with disdain, now appeared to want to disappear. The older officer, realizing the colossal error they had made, tried to mend the situation, but the words seemed difficult to find. "Ma'am, we didn't know," he began hesitantly, still holding the badge as if afraid to return it. Clara interrupted him, her voice firm but devoid of resentment. "The fact that you didn't know who I am doesn't justify the treatment I received. I am no better than anyone else, and you don't have the right to treat anyone based on assumptions." Her words echoed in the uncomfortable silence that now dominated the scene. She knew she had the opportunity to make a lasting impact here, and so she chose her words carefully. The weight of the injustice she had suffered was still fresh in her mind, but her goal was not to humiliate or provoke, but to educate. The older officer, visibly shaken, finally returned the badge to Clara, his hand trembling slightly.
"We apologize, ma'am. This was a huge misunderstanding." Clara took the badge back, looked around, and saw that the officers' gazes were now completely different. She knew that what had happened that night would be remembered for a long time. The young officer, the most aggressive until then, could not hide his embarrassment. Clara understood that while they had learned a valuable lesson, the mistake made could not be erased. With one last look at the group of officers, Clara decided it was time to leave. She closed the car door calmly, but her heart was still racing. Despite her composed demeanor throughout the encounter, the internal tension began to release. Placing her hands on the steering wheel, she took a few deep breaths, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't the first time she had faced a situation like this, but this time felt different. She had the power to change the narrative of this episode, to pursue a path that would directly impact those responsible for the unjust approach. After all, she was a district attorney. She could initiate a formal investigation into the case, file complaints, and demand accountability for the officers. She knew she had the knowledge and tools to do this. However, a part of her hesitated. Clara had always believed that the best way to change a corrupt system was through education, through dialogue, not by immediate retaliation. She knew that if she proceeded with a complaint, those officers would likely lose their jobs, and maybe they deserved it. But what would really change in the system? Would replacing them with others merely lead to a repeat of the same behavior in no time? As she reflected, the events of the night continued to swirl in her mind. The expressions on the officers' faces when they discovered who she was, the mix of fear and embarrassment in their eyes. Clara knew her position had made an impact on them, but what if she were someone else, a regular person, without the weight of a title, without a badge? Would the outcome have been the same? The road ahead was clear, but within her mind, Clara felt trapped in a moral dilemma.
Her desire for justice screamed at her not to let this slide. At the same time, her understanding of human and systemic flaws made her ponder the effects of a more conciliatory approach. The dilemma grew heavier. Clara was a woman who had dedicated her life to justice, but she knew the line between justice and revenge was very thin. She had the power to decide the fate of those men, and she also knew that any choice she made would have far-reaching consequences. She recalled the words she had spoken to the older officer, that no one should be treated based on assumptions. The truth was that she was tired of seeing this kind of behavior repeated, tired of being the one who always had to teach a lesson, who needed to prove something. For a few minutes, Clara remained there, parked, watching the city lights in the distance. She knew she had to make a decision. She could let this go, accept the apologies as she had done so many times before, or she could push forward and demand a more concrete change, an accountability that would make those officers reconsider their actions forever. With her mind still consumed by these questions, Clara started the car. Her journey back home would not just be physical, but also mental and emotional. She would need to decide how to deal with everything, the injustice she had suffered, and the system that so often proved flawed. As Clara drove through the still empty streets, her thoughts wouldn't let her rest. The city, always so vibrant during the day, now seemed shrouded in a cloak of silence that amplified the voices inside her head. The streetlights flickered by like flashes, each illuminating briefly the dilemmas she was trying to sort out. The idea of simply moving on with her life and forgetting what had happened seemed increasingly attractive. After all, it was what she had done so many other times. However, this time, something inside her wouldn't let her find peace with that decision. The disrespect, the racist jokes, the judgmental glances. Clara knew that many people, without her status, faced these situations daily with no chance to defend themselves. What if she let it go this time? Would she be contributing to others having the same experience? The thought troubled her deeply. Clara had chosen her career precisely to fight against injustices, to ensure that people were treated with dignity, no matter who they were. And paradoxically, now that she was the victim, she hesitated to act. Suddenly, she remembered a conversation she had with a close friend, also a lawyer, who used to say, "Sometimes, the price of changing the world is carrying the burden of being the exception." These words echoed in her mind. Clara knew she could be the exception and had the chance to make this episode lead to real change, not just for herself, but for many others facing abuses of power. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, feeling the weight of responsibility in her hands. Yes, she could file a formal complaint, but she knew that would bring consequences not only for the officers, but also for her own life. Such a complaint wouldn't go unnoticed by the media, and the case would gain public attention that she might not want to face at that moment. Moreover, what did she really hope to achieve? Was it the punishment of the officers, or was it the awareness of an entire system? The system was flawed, and Clara knew that even with a lawsuit, the bigger issues would persist. She wanted justice, but she also wanted a deeper, more lasting impact. As the car moved forward, Clara felt a slight sense of relief as she realized that her fight had never been just against individuals, but against an entire system that perpetuated inequality and prejudice. Perhaps the answer lay not only in punishment, but in changing mindsets. That was what she truly desired: transformation, not just a temporary remedy. As she turned the last corner before arriving home, Clara realized that her decision wouldn't be simple. She would need to reflect more, perhaps even seek advice from friends and colleagues. She knew that any path she chose would have its challenges, but one thing was certain. That night had ignited something within her, an undeniable desire to fight for deeper changes, not just in the courtroom, but in the hearts of people. With this in mind, Clara parked in front of her house, still immersed in her thoughts. The night's silence was broken only by the distant sound of sirens in the background. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the journey still ahead of her. The next morning, Clara woke up with a clearer and more determined mind. After a restless night of thoughts and uncertainties, she finally understood what she should do. The morning sun streamed softly through the curtains in her room, but unlike the tranquility of the scene, Clara felt a renewed energy to take action. She got up, grabbed her phone, and started making calls. First, she contacted a trusted colleague, someone who had always supported her in delicate situations and had keen insights into civil rights. She recounted what had happened and listened carefully to the advice he gave her. "Clara, you know you're in a privileged position, and that's exactly why your voice can resonate louder than many others. But remember, this isn't going to be easy. Are you ready for the implications? For the public scrutiny?" Clara took a deep breath. She was ready. She knew she couldn't let that episode slip away like so many others. "Yes," she replied firmly. "This time, I will take it to the end." After the call, Clara felt a lightness. There was no more room for doubt. She knew the system could be ruthless, but she also understood that her career, built on years of study and dedication, provided her with the tools to face it head-on. She decided to gather all the evidence. She had the audio recording on her phone, something she always kept on during police encounters for safety. She also recalled the security cameras on nearby streets that might have captured the incident. Clara knew these elements would be crucial in proving the officer's misconduct. Later that day, she scheduled a meeting with a group of lawyers specializing in human rights. She wanted to ensure that the case had impeccable legal coverage and that no loophole would be overlooked. She knew her story could become a symbol of resistance, but for that, she needed to be fully prepared. Throughout the day, Clara reviewed every detail of the incident, anticipating the questions that would inevitably come. Why didn't she react immediately? Why wait until the next day? She was mentally preparing herself for everything that lay ahead. The hardest step would be telling her family. She knew her parents and siblings would be worried, especially about the exposure it might bring. But deep down, she also knew they would stand by her, just as they always had. The strength of her story came from the roots of her family, from all the struggles her ancestors faced, and the victories they achieved together. By the end of the afternoon, Clara finally sent a formal email to the Police Internal Affairs Department detailing the incident. She understood that this was just the beginning of a long battle, one that would go beyond a simple apology. Clara was fighting for something much greater, something that couldn't be ignored or erased. She knew the path ahead would be full of challenges, but she was ready to face them. After all, this time, it wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who, like her, had been victims of a system that should protect, but often oppressed. Days after sending the email to Internal Affairs, Clara began receiving the first responses. To her surprise, the investigation was quickly opened, and the involved officers were temporarily suspended while the case was reviewed. Although this was a step forward, Clara understood that it was merely the first layer of a much more complex process. Local media began covering the case, and the story quickly spread across social media. Activist groups shared the complaint, while other victims of similar encounters started to recount their experiences. Clara's name gained prominence, and she found herself at the center of a public discussion about institutional racism and abuse of authority. As the scrutiny intensified, Clara felt a mix of pride and anxiety. The support from her community, her colleagues, and the broader public was uplifting, yet the weight of being a figurehead for such a critical issue was daunting. She knew that while the dialogue was opening, it also meant she would face intense scrutiny and potential backlash. She started receiving messages from strangers, some expressing solidarity and others attempting to discredit her. Clara had been prepared for this, but it didn't lessen the impact. Each comment was a reminder of the work still needed to be done. During this period, Clara leaned heavily on her support system. She reached out to friends and family, seeking advice and encouragement. She attended meetings with her legal team, discussing strategies for navigating the growing public attention and maintaining focus on the core issues at stake. As the investigation unfolded, Clara began to hear from other victims who wanted to share their stories, some of whom had been too afraid to come forward. She listened to their experiences, offering support and guidance, and in turn, they provided her with strength and renewed motivation. The case was not just about her anymore. It had become a collective voice for many. Clara realized that the journey she had embarked on was creating a ripple effect, inspiring others to stand up and speak out against injustices they had faced. While the legal battle continued, Clara also began to engage in community discussions, using her platform to raise awareness about the systemic issues within law enforcement. She participated in panels and forums, emphasizing the importance of accountability and the need for reform. With each passing day, Clara felt more empowered. She understood that the fight was not easy, but it was necessary. Each small victory fueled her determination, reminding her of the purpose behind her actions. As the investigation progressed, Clara prepared herself for whatever the outcome might be. She understood that justice could take many forms, and even if the result wasn't what she had envisioned, the conversation was already changing lives. In the quiet moments, she reflected on the significance of her journey. She thought of her ancestors, who had fought for justice long before her, and felt a sense of connection to their struggles. Clara was not only advocating for herself, but for a legacy of resilience and change. And so, as she faced the media, the challenges, and the uncertainties ahead, Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was ready to continue the fight, not just for her own justice, but for the many voices still waiting to be heard. Although there was support and solidarity from many, criticism also emerged. Some suggested that she was exaggerating or seeking fame. Clara knew that the exposure would have its price, but she did not let it get her down. She kept her focus on the greater goal: structural change. The more attention the story gained, the clearer her mission became. Now the system was reacting, but she knew she needed to maintain her calm and determination, as the real challenge was still to come. With the progress of the investigation and the growing media attention, Clara began to face the expected resistance. The process, which initially seemed to move quickly, started to slow down. Bureaucratic procedures, delays in sending documents, and postponements of hearings began to arise. It became clear that there were forces trying to prevent the case from gaining even greater proportions. At the same time, Clara received anonymous threats. Malicious messages appeared on her social media, and even intimidating calls came to her phone. Still, she did not let herself be intimidated. Each attack, each obstacle, only strengthened her determination. Her closest friends and colleagues offered support, but Clara began to realize that many were hesitant to get involved publicly. The fear of repercussions, or the simple lack of willingness to fight against such a powerful and entrenched system, often made her feel alone in this battle. Even so, Clara knew she could not back down. The case was gaining more and more attention, and she understood that yielding would mean not only a personal defeat, but also a defeat for many others who had been similarly wronged. She moved forward, aware that the challenges were just beginning. Despite all the obstacles, Clara persisted. She knew that her fight was much greater than a simple personal victory. It represented resistance against a flawed system and the search for justice for those who never had the chance to be heard. Months later, the trial finally arrived. The evidence that Clara and her team had gathered was compelling. The abusive behavior of the police officers, the failures in justifying the stop, and the humiliation she suffered could no longer be ignored. In court, before an attentive and emotional audience, the verdict was announced. Clara had won. The judicial decision was a milestone not only for her, but for society as a whole. Clara's case became a symbol of resistance, courage, and transformation. From that moment on, new procedures were implemented in the police forces to ensure fairer and more respectful approaches. Clara became an active voice against discrimination and injustice. She began giving lectures, inspiring thousands of people not to give up in the face of difficulties, to fight for their rights, and to believe that change, no matter how difficult it may seem, is possible. Her journey proved that, with determination, resilience, and courage, it is possible to transform a moment of pain into an example of hope and overcoming. Clara's smile at the end of it all represented not only her victory, but also that of many. She had become a living example that justice can prevail. It just takes us to never stop fighting for it. Now, I want to know your opinion on Clara's attitude. Do you think she did the right thing? Leave your thoughts and support for Clara in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Here, I'm always bringing you the best stories of overcoming and reflection.